BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hi there, I'm Claudia Hammond and this is All in the Mind from BBC Radio 4, the show that looks at how we think, feel and behave. I hope you're okay. Today we're going to discuss one of the hardest conversations we might ever have, saying goodbye to a loved one who's dying. Now, during the pandemic around the world, thousands of people have lost a loved one. Many of those people have had what they know will be their final conversations with them, sometimes on a phone held by a nurse or emailed and read out to them. Now, this is never going to be an easy conversation, but it is one that a lot of us will face, whatever illness our relatives or friends might be dying from. So we thought this would be a good time to tackle this difficult topic. What should you say, and how can you avoid regrets afterwards about what you didn't say? Now, every conversation is going to be different, of course, and thank you so much to all of those of you who got in touch. Your experiences shaped the conversation I had with Janie Brown, who spent more than 30 years nursing and counselling people dying from cancer. And she recounts some of her experiences in her book, Radical Acts of Love, How We Find Hope at the End of Life. And I spoke to her along with writer Audrey Nieswandt, who told me what happened to her.
My mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I had just given birth to my third child, my daughter, and over the course of her illness, which took 6 months, she refused treatment and surgery, which angered us as a family at the time. But now, looking back, I see that perhaps it was a wise decision. She was also a nurse, and so she had undergone and also witnessed other people and their journeys with cancer. But the experience with my mother was much more intimate. When we as children become caregivers, it changes the nature of the relationship in a fundamental way.
And I noticed, Audrey, that you said you rubbed your mother's feet with lotion. And Peter emailed to say that his mother was dying and there was no response from her when they tried to talk to her. But he held one of her feet and then sort of 20 minutes later she said, "That's lovely, your hands are so warm." Janie, do you think sometimes that touching people can almost replace those conversations or make it easier to just be with somebody?
When we sit with someone who's dying, there's a feeling so often of helplessness. So touch is such a beautiful way to connect. Sometimes you walk into a room and someone's in the far corner because they don't know how to get close to the person they love. Touch conveys a sense of safety. I'm here. I'm going to sit with you here until you cross that threshold.
And people have said to us they're not always sure which topics to raise. And one of our listeners, Erica, emailed us about her mother who died earlier this year. And she said, "She made me sad and angry in equal measure, but her dying weeks were not the time to share that." And so she simply loved and comforted her as she could. I wondered, Janie, do people sometimes open up old wounds? Are they sometimes too honest? Is there a right and a wrong time for that kind of thing?
I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because we bring our life's relationships with the person who are dying right there to the bedside. And so I suppose my book is a lot about how to have those conversations ahead of time. Really, if there's anger and there's unfinished business, it's very difficult to do these sort of end-of-life conversations and get some resolution. It certainly happens, but I think it takes a lot of energy that often people, obviously, at the end of life don't have.
And another listener, Jack, emailed to tell us about his sister who died in a hospice only a few weeks ago after living with addictions for many years. And despite lockdown, he was able to visit her, and so were a couple of others. But he said he did find it hard to say goodbye properly, but thinks that she knew how much she loved her. And in your article, Audrey, which is called Go, Be With Your Dying Person, you suggest from your own experiences when your mother was dying that there are almost categories that you can put visitors into who come to talk to someone near the end of their life. And you observed this going on with the different people visiting your mother. What were some of those categories?
And this is retrospectively, of course, after I had a good time to process and reflect. There were the superficial visitors who often came only once and didn't return. There were those who were looking to my sisters and my mother for help interpreting her death. There were those who were overwhelmed. There were those who were fearful and also in denial. The most uncommon visitors were those who came again and again. She actually had a very close friend that became, I guess you could call her night angel. She'd let herself into the house late at night after midnight, and then she stayed by my mother's bedside until dawn. And during that time, she was praying with my mother, chatting with her, reading to her. When my mother became comatose at the end, she still continued to come and keep her vigil with my mother. And I think it was a an amazing show of friendship and commitment, and also a desire to be there with my mother as she died.
Yeah, so she sounds as though she did find a way of doing just the right thing, in a way. Janie, are there things you should try to avoid when you're visiting someone who's dying, and things that you should try to do?
I mean, I wish we started this earlier, if we can teach children how to be comfortable. And when I work with young people who have children and their parents are dying, children, especially if someone's dying at home, wander in, they act as though, here's mommy or daddy, and they're the same person to the child in a way. Then the awkwardness is, what you don't see in young children. They come and go, they bring things to show their parent. As Audrey said, it's not always the thing that the person wants to do is to have a conversation, especially a superficial one. And that's a beautiful story, Audrey, about, the angel that came and sat with your mother, because in a way I can imagine that that's what most people want. So to pace and mirror what the person in the bed is doing. So if the person in the bed is exuberant, and I visited a woman a couple of years ago who, really was comatose, and then when her family arrived, she kind of woke up and said, let's sing together, and everybody was absolutely shocked. So sometimes when there's a lot of people in the room, there's a lot of carry-on and conversations and memories, and the person in the bed gets forgotten. But then I look at the family constellation, I'm sure that's probably how it happened in life.
Audrey, what other tips would you give for somebody visiting somebody who's dying?
I think many visitors are uncomfortable with setting themselves aside. I think we bring so much emotion and feeling to the situation of someone that we love dying that it's hard not to let it color our conversation and our reactions. So as Janie mentioned, being able to come into a room and read the room and understand what your dying person needs in that moment. There were times when I went into my mother's room and wanted to speak with her, yet she wasn't in the frame of mind to do that, or she was sleeping. We never had one large conversation about the meaning of my mother's dying, but she did speak of it in snippets here and there over the course of the 6 months.
And sometimes people are worried about talking about dying, and one of the All in the Mind listeners who emailed us was Peter, who is in his 70s and lives in Hampshire, and his wife was diagnosed with cancer in 2011 and died 3 years later. And he recalls her having an incredible sort of will to try to fight this disease. And his biggest fear was that if he mentioned death or dying, she would take it as a signal to stop trying to live.
I mostly regret the way I handled my last years, and mostly what I didn't say. I particularly remember after my wife had her stroke, and so she wasn't able to communicate with me. One of the carers told me that my wife said to her, "I'm scared of dying." And we never sat down and talked about something that is so huge in anybody's life. And I bitterly regret that. And I'd like to think I'd do it differently if I faced that situation again. But this fear of encouraging someone to stop fighting is still with me. And I don't know if I'd do it any differently. I'm retired now, but as a profession, I was a coach, and I worked with people on their relationship issues. And I say it myself, but I was very good at it. But I'm darned if I can do nearly so well for myself.
Do you think it's affected how you would want someone to communicate with you at the end of your life?
Oh, absolutely. I've made it abundantly clear to particularly my 2 sons, don't do what I did. Talk about it, even if I haven't started the conversation. Feel that you've already got absolute permission to start it. I feel bitterly sad that my wife died without us talking about her dying, and I don't want that to happen to me or to anyone else.
I'm very moved by Peter's story. It's a story that I've heard many times where the caregiver wants to talk about the fact that their loved one is dying, but they're afraid to broach the subject because it could indicate that Peter is giving up hope. But it's how to say, would you be open to having a conversation about the what ifs? What if this doesn't go the way that we both hope it will, without giving up hope? And those are the most difficult conversations, which I think is why I get involved with a lot of those conversations, because I can help be that bridge. And as soon as the bridge has been crossed, the relief is just so huge.
And this makes me think about one of the case studies in your book. You talk about a whole series of people and how they died and what happened. And there's one called John, who's a doctor, and he was afraid of lots of different things. He was afraid that he would die in pain in hospital, afraid that the dog might die before him, afraid his family wouldn't cope without him, afraid that he would die alone. And I noticed that you, as his counsellor, helped him to deal with these fears by writing them down on a list and dealing with the ones which could be dealt with and talking about those that couldn't. Are there ways a bit like that that the rest of us could allow our loved ones to feel free to discuss their fears?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, in a way, it's what Audrey said. It's the fear of emotion that gets in the way, because as soon as you enter into one of those conversations where we're going to talk about death, means we're talking about separation, we're talking about loss. So if, you can encourage people to say, well, it's going to feel sad. I mean, most people are afraid of the process itself of dying and what might happen and physical symptoms, and how do we, make sure you have the care you need so that the likelihood of having pain at the end of life is very low if you have the right people looking after you. There's a wonderful saying that, fear shuns anonymity. If we name our fears, it actually helps us have some agency over them.
And Audrey, I wonder if you are having one of these deeper conversations, can there be a risk of almost expecting too much from the person who's dying for them to suddenly, impart some deep wisdom when that wasn't what they were like before? I had a friend who was called to his father's deathbed, him and his 3 siblings, and the father said he had something really important he wanted to say to them, and they flew in from various places and all gathered there expecting something sort of incredible. And then what the father wanted to tell them was that there was a small frying pan which was really amazing for doing sausages in, and he was worried they would throw this away and not use it when it was so good. And this was something, that they did sort of laugh about afterwards, but they were expecting something rather different from that.
Yes, I think it's that notion of our expectations. As Janie noted, there's often that conspiracy of silence where the patient, the family, and even the physicians don't acknowledge that a patient is dying. And one way to overcome that silence is to link to the emotion, to listen to them, to laugh with them, not be afraid to cry with them. One of the most poignant moments when my mother was dying, she was hooked up to one of these inevitable machines. It was actually pumping blood out of her stomach where it was pooling because the tumor blocked her digestion. I had just chased the surgeon down the hall to inquire about the prognosis. I received no answer. I was very frustrated. I returned to my mother's room. All was dark and still, and I sat by her listening to this machine pump and watching my mother's blood collect. And my mother said, "I'm afraid to die. I don't want to die." And she cried. And I just sat next to her, holding her hand, and we cried together. And it was perhaps the first honest admission of my mother's impending death.
And it sounds there as if you were doing something Janie mentions in her book, where you say that as a counsellor, your job is not to take away the sorrow or the worry, but to offer a soft place of caring for feelings to land. And that sounds as if that was what you were able to do, Audrey, for your mother. And Janie, 2 listeners, Janet and Catherine, both wrote about the comfort they gained from being physically close to their mothers as they died. And obviously in this time of the COVID pandemic, that's not always been possible for people to visit their relatives who are dying. How best can people deal with the limitations of having to, sometimes speak to them online rather than being able to be with them?
This is, of course, one of the great challenges of this time with COVID. So people are being incredibly creative to find ways to connect. Of course, using technology, and, there was a 91-year-old woman here dying in palliative care. So this big extended family got onto Zoom, and there were babies, and there was, 3 generations. And to be able to listen to your loved one's voice, hugely important. We had a young man who just died, lovely young man who had a young son, and there were friends in our community here who couldn't visit. So we put together about a 30-minute audio tape, and he heard the voices of his friends courageously saying goodbye to him. And his wife said, he perked up and he was obviously taking in those messages. We made some beautiful strings of prayer flags with photographs of friends for another young woman at the end of her life so that she could string those up across her bed and look at these faces smiling down at her.
That's a lovely idea, putting up a string of photos, like sort of bunting of friends going across the room. I have a friend whose mother died of COVID very recently, and while the friend phoned up the mother and talked to the mother because she couldn't see her and was in another country, the nurse held the mother's hand so that it was like the daughter holding her hand while she spoke to her, which I thought was a really lovely, compassionate thing of the nurse to do there. And Audrey, finally, one listener, Alana, said, there isn't any room for shyness or self-consciousness. You know, if you love them, say so in plain, easily understood words. And I guess this is, although it's so hard, it is an opportunity to do something really meaningful when you're there for that person, which could ease their final days.
Yes, and I think the opportunity to be with a dying person is an amazing experience. It is messy, it's difficult, it's challenging, it's painful. It can be so, so hard. I found that there was both such compelling cruelty in my mother's dying, and there were also moments of just the brightest beauty. And to be present for your beloved person is inherently valuable, and it's a privilege, a blessing, an honor, and fundamentally a transformative experience.
Janie Brown and Audrey Nieswandt, thank you so much for all your emails on this. They were so moving, and do take care.